Please welcome to the stage moderator Randall Lane, Chief Content Officer, Forbes, and panelists Vivek Ramaswamy, Co-founder and Executive Chairman, Strive Asset Management, and Mike Pompeo, 70th former United States Secretary of State.
All right. Hello, Shook. All right, the main course. This is not Dr. Phil, by the way, and you guys don't have to lay out on the couch, but we appreciate you coming. We got, a quick intro, though I think everyone knows about these guys, but Mike Pompeo is the answer, I think, to the best trivia question in the world, which is who's the only guy who is both the top spy in America and the top diplomat in America in entire American history. So that's a succinct and intro as you get, but
Jeopardy.
Yeah. Jeopardy and former congressman, #1 at West Point, and a veteran. So thank you for your service, sir.
Thank you.
And then we have Vivek Ramaswamy, who, okay.
There you go.
The kind of the bomb thrower of the ETF world, and a former Forbes cover, Forbes 30 under 30. So thank you both for coming. Before we start, I have to say one thing. Mike, you look great.
Thank you.
You look really good.
Yeah.
Now, if you ever want a kind of a case study in why not to go in the politics,
yes,
because ever since you got out, you look amazing. So I don't know what are you drinking? Like, what's the secret?
No, Facebook says it's been marijuana gummies, so it's all good. I'm not getting any of the money. It's actually not true, but buy the gummies. It's all good.
Now, Vivek, you were on the cover. You were a hedge fund manager. You were, super successful entrepreneur. You're now an asset manager. Tell us about Strive.
Yeah, so I thought I was done in business. So you guys featured me.
You became like a pundit now.
Yeah, I thought that's what I was doing, writing some books, having fun, moving on to a new phase of life, having kids. Had more hair in that cover picture than I do now. But at the end of the day, I was writing about this stakeholder capitalism phenomenon in modern American life, where businesses said they didn't just need to make products and services for profit, but they also had to take on these social issues. Wrote a couple of books that was critical of this trend. I respected the view, but I disagreed with it. But at the end of the day, I said, you know what? Rather than just writing about these problems and complaining about it, we got to solve it through the market. So we launched Strive. It's a new asset manager where we basically vote our shares and we tell underlying companies to focus on delivering excellent products and services to your customers, make money for your shareholders, and that's it. No other social agendas. Leave politics to the politicians. And that's how capitalism works, and so that's what we're trying to bring back, bring American capitalism back.
So who's put money in? You got a kind of an all-star roster here.
We have a diverse roster of people who've put money into the parent company Strive, from Bill Ackman on the center left to Peter Thiel on the right to folks off the political axis. Those are the people who helped get Strive off the ground financially. We've launched 3 funds, and we try to keep it pretty simple. Right? The first was an energy fund, and you'll love the ticker here. The ticker is DRILL, D-R-L-L, which tells energy companies.
Very subtle, I like that.
Keep it simple is what I've learned. So you tell U.S. energy companies, you drill, you frack, you do whatever you need to do to make the most money for your shareholders without regard to somebody else's environmental or cultural agenda. And so the story goes. So we're basically bringing new ETFs to market that tell companies excellence over politics. And I hope that's a difference that's missing in the marketplace.
Now, let's talk about what's going on. Today, you guys together had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal talking about China and the semiconductor industry and the risk that you guys see in terms of President Xi making a move sooner rather than later in Taiwan, and how that could affect global markets. Maybe explain.
Sure, I'll take the first swing at that. So in the tail end of my time as Secretary of State, it became very clear to me that the fact that we not only did not but could not make high-end semiconductors, the wafers here in the United States, came to greatly concern me as a national security matter, both in terms of hardware but also economically. It's what drives our economy forward. And so myself and Secretary Ross began conversations with all of the big folks in the industry, from the tool makers to the consumers to the folks who actually make the waivers, and said, how do we bring this back? How do we get this into not just America, but to reliable partners so that we can be sure that we have supply chains that are functional for our economy and for our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. And we quickly came to conclude TSMC was a linchpin for this. The risk there is enormous, a lot of history with Taiwan and China and the United States. And so we began to reshape how we thought about it, and it ultimately led to what became the CHIPS Act, which has its own shortcomings, but will, I believe, ultimately drive the capability inside the United States to make relatively state-of-the-art tools for our customers around the world to use.
But it's a little bit of a race against time.
No, the clock is...
Because you talk in the op-ed today about
Yeah.
maybe a year or two where you think...
So everybody's got their own opinion on timing. I never get timing particularly right, but we know that Xi Jinping has real intentions. It's a double-edged sword. He needs TSMC as well. And so I was in Taiwan 8 days ago talking to them about how they're going to do it, when they're going to do it, and what it is they're actually going to do when they build this facility that's just outside of Phoenix. Very important. Speed matters. There is a bridge. These fab plants take 2, 3, 4, depending on American regulatory policy, 6 years to go build. And we need to get after it just as quickly as we can because we don't have a lot of time.
You guys talked about President Xi about to reach a third term and how that maybe could unleash him to make a move on Taiwan. Maybe talk about that.
Go ahead. Vivek.
Yeah, I mean, he's taking this over next week. So I think there's no way President Xi Jinping was actually going to make this move before next week because he didn't want to destabilize taking any risk on his grip on power. But I think after next week, the calculus changes. And the thing that strikes me, Randall, and we were talking about this earlier today as well, is I think this is the #1 underappreciated risk in capital markets today, right? You will hear the world's largest asset managers shout from the foothills about climate risk, about board diversity risk, saying that's about managing the long-run interests of your clients. Maybe that's so. They will not say a peep about the #1 risk hiding in plain sight, which is a disruption of the global semiconductor supply chain. You know, these phones, these microphones, that clock, even the refrigerator that kept your water cool before you're drinking it, depends on global semiconductors originating in Taiwan. And if China controls the global semiconductor supply chain, we are beholden to the whims of the CCP to live our modern way of life. That is a shock to the financial system. And I got to admit, it is a shock to me that the top asset managers who claim to warn about all of these risks, both to investors as well as to underlying portfolio companies, are so conspicuously silent about it. One of the large asset managers in the world includes Intel in its so-called climate-focused universe, without actually talking to Intel at all about the China-specific risk that could be an opportunity for American semiconductor companies. And at the end of the day, I hope American semiconductor companies step up and fill the void to say that if we produce here, we can actually mitigate that risk. I mean, that's the message we're delivering to semiconductor companies, but I hope more asset managers join in that movement.
Yeah, I just add to that. This is a real financial risk. So my hat was as your Secretary of State, but the truth is this is an enormous economic risk. As a fiduciary, as someone who is responsible for the assets, we've all seen what we've gone through writing off assets in Russia as a result of what's happening in Ukraine. That pales in comparison to the risk that sits out there from people who are connected to the supply chain that emanates from this southwest part of a very small island that Xi Jinping intends to overtake. And to your point about timing, it's not just about military conquest. Xi Jinping has scores of tools to take that asset, that jewel, that internationally important economic asset sitting on that island and make it more in his control and less in the control of those of us who believe in basic rights and human dignity and things like the rule of law, contracts, simple stuff.
But the conventional wisdom is they won't do it because they would blow up their own economy. But you guys talk about the idea that they could invade Taiwan without invading Taiwan.
They co-opt it. They use political influence. They run espionage operations. They blockade there are scores of ways that you could keep the plant alive and put it inside of your orbit, your capacity to not own it perhaps, but control it.
Secretary Pompeo, you mentioned, Russia, Ukraine, the parallels there. Maybe talk about that. It does seem like we're seeing right now in Western Europe with the kind of supply-demand imbalance, something similar playing out right now in real time.
Yeah. I'll let Vivek speak to this too, but we were talking about it. The cold winter in Europe pales in comparison to the cold winter if Xi moved on Taiwan. It's not remotely close in terms of destruction to capitalism, markets, our way of life here. It is really tough. They made a terrible decision to say we're going to run the whole world on sunshine and windmills. Right? This was the European plan. I was there when President Trump looked him in the eye and said, this is going to end badly. If you close your nuclear power plants, walk away from coal, depend on a single pipeline that Vladimir Putin thought was so valuable he blew it up himself. It pales in comparison to what we would all suffer if Xi moved on Taiwan.
And I think the parallels between the two situations are actually pretty striking, all right? You have Western Europe that has self-inflicted damage for the last 7 years, shooting its own capabilities to produce oil and gas for itself, that then makes it reliant on Russia. I sometimes joke that ESG stands for export Soviet gas, because that's the effect that it's had on global energy markets. But in all seriousness, put yourself in Vladimir Putin's shoes. There's a cost and there's a benefit to going for Ukraine. Well, you know the West is going to sanction you, but they can't sanction me as much if they're reliant on me for my oil and gas. I'll take the bet. He goes for it. That's Russia-Ukraine. Very similar calculus as it applies to China-Taiwan. At the end of the day, if the US is really reliant, self-reliant on semiconductor production, then Xi Jinping has one less reason to go soon for Taiwan. It's not, I'm saying that economics is the only motivation, but it's one motivation. And at the end of the day, if the US is actually able to shore up its own production capabilities, that could actually change the calculus of Xi Jinping, just like if we had actually produced energy both here and in Western Europe more effectively, Vladimir Putin may not have gone for Ukraine. And this is where I just think this audience, I mean, people think, and by the way, this is one of my heroes sitting next to me here for the sphere of politics, so I want to recognize his work as Secretary of State. I really mean that. But I want to say something to the people in this room too, and I think you agree with me on this, is that market action can make a difference too, okay? At the end of the day, if the shareholders in these companies are advising them of the actual risks that they face, bring the semiconductor production back home. We launched this ETF this week, SHOC, shock, to prepare for the shock to the system. That's a different message than you hear from the world's largest asset managers. To US energy companies, drill, frack, do what you need to do to be the best version of yourself without worrying about a Scope 3 emissions cap that got imposed on you. If you're Chevron, that makes our economy stronger. I think it makes our country stronger, and I think it better serves the everyday investors too. So I just think this crowd can make every bit as much of a difference as politicians in Washington, D.C.
Well, talk about, you know, I think we all agree if there's going to be change in the world, it's going to come from the private sector in terms of sustainable change. Talk about your letter to Chevron, what you've been doing with Drill and Chevron.
Yeah, so you probably hear the term greenwashing, which is an ESG fund that says it's going to do something and they don't do something. I don't want to be in the business of excellence washing. And so what I mean by that is when we said we're going to stand for excellence in corporate America, we're going to do it. So I've been engaging with U.S. energy companies, Strive has been, since we launched Drill. One of those engagements was a public letter that I sent to the board of directors of Chevron. Sent it straight to CEO Mike Wirth. He replied that evening, had dinner with the CFO the following week and a couple of executives. And the question we asked is, look, why is it in Chevron's best business interest to adopt a Scope 3 emissions cap, which says that your customers have to buy less of your own fuel? That'd be like McDonald's taking responsibility for reducing the body weight of America for anyone who's ever eaten a Big Mac without asking the customer to share any responsibility. Hey,
it works.
The customer took the responsibility, you know. So that's what we, that would make very little sense for Chevron. And the beautiful thing about it to see about this is, actually, I think they really welcomed that debate. I mean, they've been engaging in that in a way that's been missing. And, you know, at the end of the day, whether it's one view that's right or a different view that's right, what we really need is more diverse views in those boardrooms. The view that says companies should focus on excellence, that's what's been missing. And the funny thing is when that Scope 3 proposal was first proposed at Chevron, it was actually proposed by a Dutch nonprofit that said their motives had nothing to do with shareholder value. Chevron initially said that they were against it. But when the 3 largest asset managers in the world voted in favor of that proposal, that's when Chevron had to change its behavior. So that's where I think asset managers can make a difference in the way these companies behave, but it's going to take some courage.
For sure. Yeah. You know, fair points on ESG. It's not transparent. It is too political. How even do you define it? That said, you know, take the McDonald's example. There are, you know, American people, though, the customer ultimately is asking for some of this. So isn't this just companies, isn't just corporate America in the truest capitalist fashion responding to its customers?
It's a great question. So I'll take a crack at this, and we were talking about this in previous conversations as well. So some customers are asking for it, right? So what I say is very clear about this. If you, with your own money,
if there was a Diet Big Mac, I'd be all over it.
Right. If you're the customer, it's your choice. If with your own money you want to deliver an environmental agenda or a social agenda to a company's boardroom, it's a free country. You're free to do that. Strive, by the way, would not be a good home for your capital. We absolutely would not be the right fiduciary for you. But if you need a voice that says, you know what, companies should focus just on making products and services for profit, ironically, that's the voice that's missing today. And what happened, this is the dirty little secret that not a lot of people know, is that what happened is starting about 2018, when Trump, your prior boss, pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords. What happened was CalPERS and the state of New York, they went to the large asset managers and they said that you need to adopt firm-wide commitments using all of the money you manage to advance the Paris Climate Accords, modern diversity, equity, inclusion standards, or else we, California or New York, will not do business with you. So understandably, I don't blame them, the large asset managers said that, you know what, well, some of our clients are demanding it. The problem, though, is that they took everyone's money along for the ride, and what I think we really need is true diversity. True pluralism. For the customers who want that, great, give it to them. But for everybody else, we can't smuggle that agenda in. And I think it's going to take new competitors that don't have beholden interests to solve the problem.
My only other thought on this, and I thought there's a disconnect. It's true that some customers of some of these products might want them, but the transparency is completely missing.
There's no transparency.
It doesn't exist. So the truth is, even if you wanted that, you couldn't tell where to go and get it. And if there's no diversity, you don't really have much option.
I do think, though, that a lot of these corporations, what they're trying to do is front run. You know, they don't want government to tell them what to do. So in some ways, they're acting, and in some ways, that's what capitalism does. It evolves. It's evolving because nobody in this room wants more regulation, and so this is kind of business self-regulating itself. Maybe what's wrong with that?
Again, if you stare at the board member's responsibility, it is to maximize value. If in fact they conclude that if it's about to come and they're getting in front of it, that means that the other place consumers interact, which is at the ballot box, where they elect the people who set those very rules that you're describing that everybody is afraid will come. Don't elect folks who are going to do precisely what it is these folks are trying to get out in front of. Because in the end, I have to tell you, it was important that we had a powerful military as the Secretary of State. But the single biggest tool I had to convince leaders around the world to do what it was we wanted them to do was you. It was the American economy. They wanted to be part of our energy sector. They wanted an LNG terminal. They wanted American innovation and technology. They wanted to partner with American industry. And so I was glad I had a Navy and an Air Force, but I was really glad I had an economy that was crushing it and a president who wasn't going to regulate us all out of business.
I think you asked a really good question, and I love the fact that we can actually, you have such echo chambers that you don't get good debate in this ESG debate, so let's actually engage with that idea. What you'll hear is that it's about the long-run interests of the firm. So I love talking about specifics, okay? So one of the other letters that I wrote on behalf of Strive and Strive's clients was to the board of directors of Apple. That was to question Apple's decision to adopt a racial equity audit that we felt could make Apple a less competitive company. So the question is that in the long-run interest? That's what you'll hear, because it's staving off some other kind of regulation and gets ahead of societal challenges. Well, here's the mystery. The organization that put up the proposal said that this was about dismantling Apple's role in perpetuating white supremacy. Apple's board initially said that this believed they have nothing to do with shareholder value, and so they opposed it. And yet it was only after the large shareholders, including the large shareholders of Apple, big financial institutions, voted in favor of it, that they decided to conduct that audit. So I think what's going on is, in the disguise of long-run agendas and long-run value, it actually has nothing to do with long-run value, and it's about advancing a social agenda, which might be good, it might be bad. But if it's good or bad, let's decide that at the ballot box, not through capital.
Right. Or maybe, again, I think this is a great, and I love that we can talk about it. We're in a room full of capitalists. So let's talk about capitalism. What a great place to be. What you guys are talking about is it's Friedmanomics, right? Milton Friedmanomics. I actually got to interview him before he died, which was a great honor. It was a great honor. That said, I also consider myself dirty word maybe, on this couch here, a stakeholder capitalist, in that if you listen to the American people, and I was on the board with Paul Tudor Jones of Just Capital. We surveyed 20,000 Americans to find out what Americans want, not what activists want, not what this group or that, but it exactly tried to mirror geographically, race, religion, everything, what Americans want. And you do hear that Americans care, the first thing they care about are employees. If you ask Americans, what do you care, what's a good business do? Employees, and they care about the customers, and they care about the community. Stakeholders actually last, according to the American people. So how do we square freedom?
Shareholders are last.
Yes.
So look, I think that at the end of the day, you're not going to build a successful business for shareholders if you don't have great employees and take care of them and look after your business partners as long-run partners rather than short-run partners. But here's the problem, and I actually, while I love Milton Friedman and respect him every bit as much as you do, I don't consider my view on stakeholder capitalism to be the same as his view. Because he was all about making companies just allow them to make widgets more profitably. I agree with that, but there's more to the story. I think this is about protecting democracy. And what I mean by that is the questions that we're talking about here, racial injustice, climate change, I'm not denying the importance of these questions. I'm saying that they're so important that every citizen's voice and vote ought to count equally without letting the guy with the most money in the room dictate the answers to those political questions.
This is.
And that's the fundamental piece. And the other piece is de Tocqueville. Thank you. I mean, if you even listen to go back in history, listen to Alexis de Tocqueville here. One of the things he said is, a divided body politic, a diverse democracy like ours, will not last unless you have apolitical institutions that bind us together across our disagreements. And to me, that's the beauty of American capitalism. It's not red or blue, it's the pursuit of green money together, because that's what gets us across the lines of partisan politics. That's why it's important to keep the private sector apolitical too, because American solidarity, I think, depends on it.
That's absolutely right. And go ahead.
No, go ahead.
De Tocqueville also talked about how he traveled through America, and everybody was a merchant. That's what he noticed. But everyone was a merchant looking out for their community as well as themselves. So I think there is common ground here. But
I agree with that. It is absolutely essential. So I ran a small business. I wasn't nearly as wildly successful as Vivek was.
About that. Yeah.
I ran a small company. I cared deeply about the success of my employees, their families. We had 300 or 400 people. I cared about it for lots of reasons, because I cared about them as a human being, and also I needed them to be successful and make really good machine parts so that I could take care of my shareholders and my team as well. These aren't mutually exclusive. What you can't have is an external political agenda being driven by people who may or may not even share the interests of those employees. I can promise you, this was in South Central Kansas. These were mostly farmers running the machines during the day. They were good stewards of their land. They wanted clean rivers, clean air. They cared about it a lot. They didn't want any of the woke. So if you had driven that down into my organization, you would have been doing something that drove them crazy. To his point, we should keep all of that out. No one's asking for them to adopt my view of the world in boardrooms, my political view of the world in boardrooms. We're simply asking them to function.
how did your private sector experience inform you at either CIA or at State?
Oh my goodness. By the way, being CI director is the best gig. If you ever get a chance. hell of a deal.
State, not so much.
State Department's a totally different beast, yes. It was the perfect grounding in that it gave me a chance to meet real people, work with real people, understand the risks, what it means to put capital at risk. It also gave me an understanding of the power when you do it well, what that means to the lives of people all across the country. Not only my employees, but the employees of my customers who were always screaming at me because the parts were late, my suppliers who thought I wasn't paying enough. The whole ecosystem gave me an understanding of the American economy and the American economic system from admittedly a small point of view, but that was enormously helpful when I came to CIA and State, because many of the problems can be answered in the world, can be answered by who's got the money, right, who's got the resources. We often think about militaries, but economic power is at the center of so much collision across the world.
Economic power and economic cooperation. If you kind of look at some of your legacies, I mean, the Abraham Accords have to be right up there. And if we're going to have, that's right. And if we're going to have peace in the Middle East, if we're going to have peace in the world, have them make money together, and they might not fight with each other. And I think
it's happening. There are a lot of Israelis in Dubai today making a lot of money, and that's all good.
I think it's interesting to just take. I agree with everything that's been said, but just to see the other side of this that I know you have great insight into is, we did think that model would work with China, right? I mean, our whole model of democratic capitalism with China throughout the 1990s was predicated on the idea that we'd export Big Macs and Happy Meals, and somehow that was going to spread democracy to the Chinese state. And what we realized was that actually that game could be played in reverse too. So I think there's cases where it works, but there's also cases in which China recognized that global capitalism was the Trojan horse that we could not resist. You know, Troy and Paris of Troy could not resist the Trojan horse of Troy. We could not resist the sweet taste of global capitalism when it was actually a mercantilist force in part influenced by the Chinese state in reverse, which is what actually I think creates the kinds of semiconductor supply chain imbalances that we see in our capabilities here in the United States. So I think it's important not to just fall myth to that old 1990s mantra, because I think China has in some ways called that bluff, creating the very issues that I think we suffer today.
It's a fascinating concept, a fascinating idea. I think that's absolutely true. Here's what's interesting. I would meet with Chairman Kim in North Korea, and I would immediately go to Vietnam, if you look at my travels, because I would tell Chairman Kim, you can be like them too. We can be at war with you, and then you can have a thriving economy. When I would travel to Vietnam, by the way, and American friends and partners, I would travel to Vietnam, and the first thing the senior leader there would do is he'd pull me aside and he'd say, I'm with you. I think that's all great. If you could lay off the communist thing a little bit. Because that's our model, too. The truth is, it's not about their internal dynamics. It's not the Chinese Communist Party's internal dynamics that cause us to have so much concern. It is their external efforts to change the way we all live in the world, and their refusal to play by the same set of rules that everyone in the rest of the world lives by. And we've been the stooge. We've been the fools. We call it whatever, greed, naive. You can explain it a million ways. We've permitted the Chinese Communist Party to behave in ways that we wouldn't let Norway, we wouldn't let New Jersey, and we wouldn't let anybody else, right? We literally said, nope, special rules for thee, because they had a 1.4 billion people. And that's the thing that causes Vivek and I to say, nope, you've got to get this back on board. We've got to make sure they are participating in the global ecosystem in the same way that we demand everyone else does. However they want to govern themselves, that's for you all to sort through. But as it impacts Americans and American citizens, we're going to demand you behave the way that everyone else does.
And I think that it's important, just to ground this in a specific example that actually ties the ESG discussion with this China discussion. Let's just take the case of U.S. energy, right? You have large institutional asset managers and financial institutions pressuring firms like Exxon and Chevron to drop projects here in the United States. Now, that's in the name of fighting global climate change, right? Well, it turns out that some of those same projects are actually proceeding. Isn't that a mystery? They're proceeding on the other side of the world when firms like PetroChina pick up those same projects. And then you look at who are the top shareholders of PetroChina, and they include some of the very large financial institutions in the US who are telling Exxon and Chevron to drop those projects. That is not a coincidence. I think it is by design. The Chinese Communist Party understands, it's the theme of this session, right? ESG for thee, China for me. If you tell them you're going to apply an ESG standard to PetroChina, they're going to tell you to close the door and shut the door on your way out. But you want to tell the United States to do it at the same time, we will roll out the red carpet for you to do business here in China. And I think that's how they've turned this game on its head, where the largest corporations in the US are multinational corporations, but they use the carrot of access to the Chinese market to get the monkey to jump as high as it will jump. And the biggest of those monkeys are the big asset managers, but second on the list is the companies who follow their mandates from the US energy sector to otherwise. And we've been blind to this for 30 years. I think that over the next decade, not just as a political matter, but as an investment matter, I think these are the kinds of China-related investment risks that we're going to have to wake up to if we care about actually maximizing value.
If you want to go deep, Vivek has a new book out, Nation of Victims, just came out last month. I was reading it today. Mike, you have a book coming out in January. Tell us, give us a preview. The book is called
Never Give an Inch. If you read it, we gave an inch from time to time, but it's a great title. And it talks about our 4 years, how we tried to put you all first as we thought about the world.
Okay. All right, we'll see it in January. All right, we got 2 minutes left. Last question. Everyone's asking this. 2024 election coming up. Everyone wants to know the answer from somebody on this stage about running. Vivek, are you going to run for
Yes.
Senate in 2024 in Ohio?
I can confirm that I will not be running for dog catcher, president, or Senate of the United States. So, but I think people are waiting to hear that from somebody,
Yes.
certain other person
All right,
on
let's get
stage.
that out of the way.
I don't want to get the
Mike,
suspenseful moment on.
2024.
I will not make the same confirmation, Vivek. Yeah.
I'm glad. I'm glad to hear it. I'm glad to hear it.
And what as you ponder this, what are the factors?
Oh my goodness. So the question is like, how do you think about whether you're going to go to Iowa, New Jersey, and New Hampshire, and South Carolina and campaign? You have long, deep, private conversations with your wife, and we're sorting it through. If we think it's the right time and the right place, we'll go try to make the case to the American people that I ought to be the president. If not, we'll find someone really good to go support.
Will.
I just want to say one thing about that.
Please do.
Secretary Pompeo is being shy, but I think that, tell me if you think this is fair. As a party, the Republican Party may be too focused on even the question that you asked, which is the person, as opposed to asking, what does it mean actually to advance that American agenda? It's easy to say America first.
Yeah.
It's harder to actually advance that agenda. And
Yeah.
regardless of who it is.
Yeah.
Is there not room to advance that conversation without regard to obsessing over
There's
the
a
question of
natural
who the person
politician
is?
right here.
Yeah,
I think because this is the guy who does that.
It's actually very true. You ask about me, what am I going to do? Far more important to me is that the ideas, the things that I care about, the things we've been speaking about tonight, move forward. And it not only means talking about them and campaigning on them, but I was inside the beast for 4 years. It is quite something to move that beast and actually execute and deliver on behalf of the American people. And so I hope whoever we end up picking has the temerity to run a good campaign, because you got to get elected, but in the end, actually delivers against the commitments they made in a way that respects our nation's history.
Thank you.
I think if you do run, you got a couple hundred new supporters here, and but we appreciate both of you guys coming here. Vivek's hanging around too if you want to hear more about Shrub. But thank you
Thank you very much.
Secretary Pompeo, thank you. Thanks for a great conversation.
Thank you.
We there is common ground in this room, and I love that. So thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Thank you. That was fantastic. Thank you very much.
This one? Thank you.